So I'm honestly kind of contributing to the problem by even making this video because dwelling on any one given poll on any given day is probably on balance somewhat disinformative, which is to say that you can't extrapolate too much about the state of a primary race, especially one whose first contest will not begin for another, 6 months from any particular poll. However, because polling is so central to the process in how the debate system is constructed and how any number of other factors with regard to the primary race are viewed, we're sort of forced by necessity to take these polls probably more seriously than they ought to be. So with that disclaimer, there was a poll today put out by Monmouth, which is generally regarded to be among the most reliable pollsters, and it was a national poll, and the most significant finding was that Biden dropped fairly precipitously. So Biden is at 19% nationally in this poll, which is a 13% drop since June, and is one of the very few times in recent memory that he has actually not been at the statistical lead in a national poll. Now, there are other national polls taken from within the same time period that do maintain him at the lead, around 30%. So this could be thought of as something of an outlier, but outliers can sometimes be correct. So, it just depends on how you look at it. Could this potentially mean that voters are more attuned to what I've been calling the cognitive malfunctions that Biden commits virtually every day, and which undercut the central argument for his candidacy, which is that he's the safest and most electable choice against Trump? You're not particularly safe if you fail routinely to complete your sentences and you, on a daily basis, show evidence that your mental faculties have severely diminished. Perhaps I've been a little wary about how the media has been covering those cognitive malfunctions, as I've mentioned before in videos and on Twitter and elsewhere, because they tend to frame them as, quote, gaffes, as if they're just innocuous mistakes that we all make every now and then. In the case of Biden, it's just starkly different. I watched last night a campaign appearance that Biden made in 2007 when he was running in that cycle for the presidential nomination, and his lucidity is far, far more pronounced than it is now. So, any reasonable observer, I think, would have to conclude that he's diminished very noticeably in the ensuing 12 years. And voters, despite the bad media coverage, might be becoming aware of that, although it's possible that this is sort of a outlier poll, considering especially the sample size, which is only 298 people. Now, as you know, people get mad at me all the time for cautioning against this instinct toward statistical nihilism that I seem to detect when there's a poll result that comes out that you don't like. If you say you're a Bernie supporter and Bernie's not doing so well in one poll, you'll get a flood of people saying, oh, look at the methodology, look at how terrible this poll is. Yeah, methodologies vary from poll to poll, and some are maybe better than others, but I don't think it's necessarily constructive to constantly be questioning the methodological soundness of every poll because you don't happen to like the result. And sure enough, today's poll from Monmouth is an example of why that's sort of a folly, because Sanders is technically in the lead in this poll. He's at 20%, so a fraction ahead of Warren, who's also at 20%, and Biden's at 19%, which basically puts them in a tie. And that would seemingly bode well for Sanders, but a lot of times you get from Sanders supporters this sort of reflexive rejection of any poll, which seems to have methodological features that they have determined are unreliable. So, given that this poll obviously advantages or shows a decent result for Biden, relative to, a decent result for Sanders relative to Biden anyway, you're probably not going to see a whole lot of Sanders supporters come out and say, "Oh, we're calling foul the methodology," blah blah blah. But it stands to reason that there's something to it that shows Sanders and Warren with a modest uptick that has coincided with Biden's decline. It could just be that Biden's supporters are not really ideological, and as a result of new doubts about his electability, they're simply going with the other candidate who seemed to have a reasonably good chance and who they also know of and maybe vaguely like. So that's plausible. But don't discount a poll just because it has a methodology that you think reflexively is suspect. Doesn't mean that you should suspend all disbelief about every single poll, but it just doesn't really accomplish much to get into that whole mindset where you're unskewing every poll with a seemingly unwelcome result. So another few interesting findings. Tulsi does not qualify per this poll. She's at 1%. And it's worth dwelling on that a little bit because, as I mentioned with regard to the sample size, they're getting ready to exclude Tulsi from the September beta on pretty spurious grounds. Because if you're only polling 298 people, I'm not discounting the utility of the poll, but I'm saying that making such minor differences in results be so overwhelmingly, dispositive in terms of what they portend for a candidate's inclusion or exclusion in the debate is silly. So, given the small sample size here, the difference between a qualifying poll and a non-qualifying poll literally comes down to a fraction of a person. Maybe not literally, but, it comes down to what amounts to essentially a fraction of a person. Because 1.4% versus 1.5% in this poll is literally less than a person. Right? So, should that statistical triviality really make all the difference with respect to whether a candidate with obviously a fairly enthusiastic following, online in particular, is permitted in the debate? I don't think so. Another odd thing is this poll measures the favorability ratings of the candidates, but they don't measure it for all the candidates. So Tulsi's favorability rating is not measured here, but you get a favorability rating for Joe Sestak, the former congressman from Pennsylvania who almost nobody has heard of. I had heard of him because he had a high-profile race in 2006 and 2010, and then again, arguably in 2016. But the average Democratic primary voter is nowhere near informed enough. I'm not judging them, but they're not as attuned enough to this stuff to know who Joe Sestak is. Yet, Monmouth decides to poll his favorability ratings, which is sort of almost meaningless. And interestingly, although Warren's favorability is on a steady upward trajectory, the candidate who got the highest net favorability increase, so who increased the most in terms of their favorability rating from the previous time it was measured, is not Warren, but Yang. Yang is up 13% in his favorability rating compared to the last time the poll was taken in May. And that's sort of interesting. Whereas you have others who have gone down fairly noticeably, such as Klobuchar, who's down 13% in that metric since May. Biden's down 16%. Sanders down 4%. Harris down 10%. And so on. But it's true, if you kind of look at it, the candidate who seems to be the most steadily rising by a variety of metrics is Warren. And I guess it's why I tend to hear from more and more people who are, seemingly in positions of relative knowledge that they're more and more convinced that Warren is going to be the nominee. Now, that seems to be kind of congealing into conventional wisdom, which should give you pause, and it gives me pause. But, there is a good argument for why that might be so. Um, we'll have to see, I suppose. And, shame on me for even doing this video, because like I said, it's a little bit foolish to extrapolate anything of major significance from any given poll. Biden's still well ahead in the averages. It's funny, you have this little cadre of super objective data guys like Nate Silver and Harry Enton who cover this stuff and claim that they don't have any preferences in terms of candidates. So, though, I think it's pretty fair to say that they're anti-Trump. I don't know why they would not want to admit that. They have this kind of quasi-objective posture. They've been fairly hostile to Bernie Sanders, and Bernie Sanders gets this good poll where he's in the lead nationally, by a fractional, arguably insignificant percent within the margin of error, granted. But nonetheless, the final finding shows that he's in the lead, and Nate Silver and Harry Enton rush to say, why you shouldn't, not that you should disbelieve the poll, but they cast doubt on the veracity of the poll, or at least the explanatory power of the poll. Nate was very quick to point out how small the sample size was, which I don't know that he had mentioned when prior Monmouth polls showed Bernie behind. And, Harry runs out to put out an item on CNN.com saying, quote, Joe Biden probably still leads the Democratic race. Okay, maybe Joe Biden does still lead the Democratic race. It's prudent to exercise caution in reaction to any given poll, like I've mentioned many times. But I think it's interesting that Harry runs out to, dispel any belief that Sanders could be ahead based on this one poll, where he's doesn't seem to have that instinctive compulsion when other polls come out that have other findings. So, don't trust these guys, or that these guys are just as these neutral observers. They have some whacked out agenda that has a political component. Maybe it's not. I don't think it's pure like partisanship or candidate antipathy necessarily, but it's something there. It's a little hard to define and ends up portraying Sanders in a less than flattering light pretty frequently. So, there you have it. Talk to you later.